Greetings, comrades. For a starting point for the revision of the final area study in prep for the exam, what I would recommend is that you have a look at this checklist, which is the essence of this area study, mental health, and then just do an audit. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What do you need to address in the lead up to the exam? So the first KKA for this AOS references the mental health continuum. So points of emphasis here are that everyone on the planet can be positioned on the continuum in terms of evaluation of their mental health, and that the positioning of individuals will be determined by a combination of internal and external factors. Risk factors will move a person towards the mental disorder end, and protective factors will pull them back the other way. And again, the positioning is fluid depending on the exposure and the combination to those internal/external factors. So check out this past VCAR question where we've got Sasha, a university student working part-time in a cafe. We've got an X here, so she's at the mental health end of the continuum, closer there than the mental illness end. And then basically you've got to pick the best option in terms of a justification why she's towards the mental health end. So you can, again, freeze the vid to work through the options. Spoiler alert, I'm going to push up the answers now. So we're looking at C here, and what makes C the best option is the fact that it emphasizes the word coping here. So it does discuss that she's stressed about her decision to transfer her course, but the fact that she's coping with the workload and is happy to have met someone is congruent with her positioning on the continuum more towards the mental health end. So we can eliminate the other options because they're incongruent with the positioning of her at the mental health end. They're more indicative of being in the middle or at the mental illness end. So points of emphasis for the First Nations SEWB framework. Start by emphasising that there's a holistic view of well-being which places self in these interconnected network of relationships, which are the 7 domains. Do you need to reel off all 7? No, but there's emphasis on the connection to each of these domains. So back to internal, external factors. So this incorporates both risk factors and protective factors, which will influence a person's positioning, fluid positioning on the MH continuum. So the point of emphasis here is if it's biological or psychological, that is within the body or the mind. So they're internal factors that you might have to identify from a scenario. And then we have external ones, which are social. This comes into play again when we look at phobias a bit later. Now, when you're asked to discuss a characteristic that indicates that somebody is demonstrating mental health, you want to go to the ones that are listed in the study design: high level of functioning, social and emotional well-being, and resilience. So let's have a look at this retro question. I love this question, where we've got some people undergoing training for a mission to Mars, and the part B is asking for a characteristic of good mental health that the psychs would be looking for. So the marking, it's asking for an identification of one. So 1 mark for talking about levels of functioning, social and emotional well-being, or resilience. And then you've got to relate it back to the scenario. And this is critical for your scenario-based questions. So if they're showing a high level of functioning, then those astronauts can operate independently on their mission. If social and emotional well-being, what does that look like? Well, social well-being would be if the astronauts can maintain positive relationships with each other, and resilience is bouncing back from little setbacks in their training, etc. Now, in terms of the distinction between stress versus anxiety versus phobias, be mindful of the common ground here, because all 3 are going to increase arousal. All 3 are potentially going to trigger dominance by the sympathetic nervous system. So therefore your response needs to come up with some dichotomy in terms of providing a point of difference. So if you're asked to differentiate between stress and anxiety, focus on tense. Stress is current. If you're experiencing a stress response, that's to a current stressor. For instance, if you're under attack, you might experience a fight, flight, or freeze response, which will be adaptive because it can help you to survive, or it can be maladaptive if it's excessive. More about that when we get to phobias a bit later, just to confuse you. Anxiety is when you're worrying about something in the future. So stress is current, anxiety is apprehension about something that's going to happen in the future. Now, if you're asked to differentiate between stress and a phobia or anxiety and a phobia, then we can focus on a couple of things. Stress and anxiety can be triggered by a broad range of stimuli, whereas a phobia is very specific. There's just a specific stimulus that will trigger that sympathetic nervous system dominance. A phobia is always maladaptive and it's quite irrational, whereas stress and anxiety can be adaptive and they can be quite rational if you are indeed under threat either now or in the future. Okay, so another retro question here. So we've got Ambreen here, and when she was a little kid, she developed a phobia of the darkness, and now she's 20 years old. So if we actually look at this question with 3 marks allocated to it, there's a bit to unpack. It's asking, firstly, is she suffering from a phobia or anxiety? So we've got to address that. And then what we need to be careful of is the next part of the question. Justify your response by comparing, that's the key thing, phobia and anxiety in relation to Ambreen. So in terms of the way the marks were allocated here, 1 mark for explaining that she is indeed suffering from a phobia. It's intense, it's persistent, it's irrational in terms of the fear of the dark, because dark can't hurt us. And then we need to link it back to the scenario and justify why it is indeed a phobia by talking about the fact that there's a level of withdrawal or dysfunction in terms of her not going out with her mates when it's dark, which it discusses at the back end of this scenario. Now, there are a lot of 2s out of 3 on this because a lot of people miss the 3rd mark. The question asked for a justification by comparing a phobia to anxiety. See, what you needed to do there was explain why it's not anxiety to get that 3rd mark. Because if it was anxiety, it would be adaptive to a perceived threat in the future. Let's have a look at this question here. As Vanessa was walking to school one morning, she swooped by Maggie. The magpie caused an injury to her head. She needed stitches. Since the injury, she ducks her head and looks around regularly for a swooping bird. Vanessa refuses to walk to school even though swooping season has ended. So the question's not using the terminology stress, anxiety, or phobia. It's basically asking you, is her response learned, conscious, reflexive, or adaptive? So the state was really split on this. A lot went for D, adaptive to a feared stimuli. So it is a feared stimuli, and it is a response, but a phobia is a maladaptive response. Okay, it's swooping season's ended. So therefore, by refusing to walk to school, that's not adaptive. She needs to get back on the horse, get back out there, discourage that avoidant behavior. A phobia is a learned response. She's been classically conditioned, so it might not be a conscious process according to the behaviorist model, but it is indeed a learned process in terms of her specific environmental trigger, which has caused some classical conditioning in this case. Now, the BPS model features heavily in this AOS, so just be mindful of the biological, psychological, and social factors that are listed in the study design. And if you're not sure, get onto the VCAR website and have a look at those key knowledge areas, because it actually specifies these guys here. Also be mindful that the BPS model looks at the interaction between all of these factors. So these are not occurring in isolation. The point of this model is that when we look at the origin of a phobia and the treatment of it, which we'll get to protective factor intervention strategies a bit later on, we're looking at an interaction of these 3 domains. Now, starting with the biological part of the BPS model is GABA dysfunction. So before you go into detail about what's wrong with somebody who has GABA dysfunction, explain the role of GABA. GABA is the major inhibitory neurotransmitter in the central NS, and so therefore it plays a key role in maintaining equilibrium in terms of the excitability of those 100 billion cells in your brain. So therefore, if we have a dysfunctional GABA system, there's a problem with the excitability of those cells, and that can be a predisposing factor for not only anxiety, but also a phobic disorder. Now, the second biological risk factor is the role of the stress response. And there's two things we need to emphasize here. Number one is if we are under threat or there is a perceived threat, then the triple F response will be activated. That could cause hyperventilation, could cause the person to have a panic attack, etc. So it's not only the fact that their body, via the fear center in their brain, the amygdala, is triggering this physiological response so that we can survive this threat, but it's also the memory of this, the fact that when we experienced a stress response and we hyperventilated and we weren't in control of our body, etc., this itself can perpetuate the phobia because of the fact that we're not in control of the way our body responds. So be mindful of that. Now, hopefully everyone's pretty savvy on LTP and being able to explain the mechanisms of it based on the fact that it was covered in Unit 3. But we need to relate this to a phobia. And what makes this a little bit tricky is if the origin of a phobia had a specific environmental trigger, a one-off, so e.g. the magpie girl has been swooped and injured, and that only occurred once. But with LTP, we need to emphasize repeated activation of those neural pathways. So even though the event might have only occurred once, we might be having flashbacks, we might be repeatedly thinking about it, and so therefore we're activating these fear pathways, and therefore the amygdala will play a key role in mediating the fear intensity of it, and the hippocampus will play a role in the consolidation of it. Now, do we have to mention the amygdala and hippocampus? Not necessarily. Just something to be mindful of if we say get a 10 marker on this, or possibly a really beefy 4 or 5 mark question. But you do need to emphasize the fact that LTP can only occur if the pathways that associate, say, the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are repeatedly activated. And that could be through a one-off experience and then repeatedly ruminating about it, thinking about it over and over again, which will strengthen that association between being outdoors and walking to school and getting swooped by a scary bird. Behaviorism is a school of psychology that argues we're all born as a blank canvas. And so therefore, if we have any mental health issues, if we've developed a phobia, that's a result of nurture, not nature. So therefore, if we've had a traumatic event, that can be the origin of our phobia. And so therefore, this model argues that phobias are precipitated, developed through an association with classical conditioning. Now, little Albert, you might have covered it, you might not. It's no longer on the study design, but I've just used this as an example where we can use the language of classical conditioning to describe the repetition of our neutral stimulus, which becomes the phobic stimulus. It's paired with something traumatic, and as a result of that LTP process I just talked about, now that neutral stimulus is the conditioned stimulus. So that's the origin of the phobia, the precipitation. And then the behaviorist model argues that this is perpetuated or maintained through operant conditioning via avoidance and negative reinforcement. Now, the cognitive school of psychology takes it a step further because it looks at the cognitive bias that is involved in the irrational judgment, because again, that's part of the definition of a phobia. It's irrational about the phobic stimulus, which can come in two forms. Either a memory bias because we've had some faulty LTP, particularly if the specific environmental trigger occurred when we were a little kid, and so therefore It's an episodic memory, and as we learned about in Unit 3, memory is not perfect in terms of our ability to consolidate it and transfer it from STM to LTM. Not that we need to go there, but each time we retrieve that memory via various cues, we need to reconstruct that memory. And so that reconstruction can add additional detail, additional fear, additional intensity. So therefore, the retrieval of the memory is far worse than it actually was, which is a cognitive bias because it's irrational. Or catastrophic thinking is thinking about the future. And so therefore, we're basically exaggerating in our mind the potential threat. We're always thinking of worst case scenarios and not thinking realistically about the fact that this phobic stimulus doesn't actually pose a legitimate threat to us. Now, I've already talked a bit about the specific environmental trigger, so just be mindful in terms of the BPS model that phobias often have a social origin where something traumatic has occurred. So therefore, the origin of the phobia is the specific environmental trigger, e.g. getting swooped by a magpie or having a scary experience in the dark. And therefore, then the biological, e.g. the GABA dysfunction, the stress response, the LTP, or the psych, whether it be a cognitive approach or a behavioural approach, will all interact in terms of the precipitation and perpetuation of the phobia. Check out this question here. We've got little Eloise, 5-year-old. She's got a mouse phobia after one crawled on her while she was asleep. And now she can't be anywhere near a mouse and refuses to go into a bedroom. Now, part B is asking, explain how a specific enviro trigger contributed to her development of the phobia. It's worth 2 marks, and the average was 0.5 out of 2. So 1 soft mark, even though a lot of students missed it, for simply for identifying the fact that it was the mouse crawling on her, it's mentioned in this scenario, that was the environmental trigger. 1 mark for that. The second mark was for explaining the fact that that caused her to freak out. She was distressed, and that was the origin of the phobia. Now, we didn't need to talk about the language of classical conditioning and the stress response and GABA dysfunction. It's asking about the social origin, the specific environmental trigger. So that's where the 2 marks were won and lost. Now, in terms of stigma, it will not precipitate a phobia. It'll perpetuate it, because the stigma will basically prevent a person from seeking out those protective factors, going and seeking help, etc., because they're worried they're going to be labelled. And so therefore we need to be mindful of what we mean by stigma. A negative label we place on a person because they're weak, because they've got this mental condition as a result of their traumatic experience. Now, the BPS model gets 2 more mentions in the study design. Firstly here, these are interventions for treating a phobic disorder. In other words, they're interventions that have been tested. We have data on them. Whereas when we look at the BPS approach to enhancing well-being and using them as protective factors, they're not interventions. So an intervention strategy is basically used to treat someone with a mental health problem, in this case, a phobia. So be mindful of that. Now, when you are talking about benzos as an intervention for treating a phobic disorder, a few points of emphasis. Number 1, you've got to mention GABA. Number 2, you've got to mention where they're targeted. They're targeted at the GABA receptors right here. And so therefore, because of the GABA dysfunction, there's not enough, we take the benzo and they mimic the effects of GABA on these receptors, which increases the inhibitory effects of GABA, and so therefore that has a calming effect and prevents the excessive response when we're exposed or potentially exposed to our phobic stimulus. The second bio-intervention strategy is breathing retraining. So points of emphasis are the fact that if we are exposed to a phobic stimulus, we might hyperventilate, and if we do, that's going to compromise our oxygen and carbon dioxide imbalance in our brain and body. And so therefore the point of breathing retraining is not only to basically provide a sense of calm, but we're also endeavouring to restore that equilibrium of O2 and CO2 in the body and the brain. Okay, let's have a look at this question here from 6 years ago. So as a kid, David would become frightened when he saw his mum scream and run away when she saw a cockroach. So there's some observational learning going on here, but I want to focus on the part B of this question. Dave's acquired the same phobia and also screamed and ran away when he saw a cockroach. So he's gone to seek help, and you've been asked to explain how breathing retraining would help him lower his anxiety levels for 3 marks. So in terms of the mark allocation here, you needed to emphasise the fact that when he sees his cockroach, he's hyperventilating. And so therefore there's an imbalance of oxygen and CO2 in his body, which is no good. That causes those symptoms, nausea, feeling lightheaded, etc. So therefore, then you need to explain the mechanism of breathing retraining. So he slows down, and some people, I remember marking this one in detail about inhaling, counting 3 in your head, pausing 3, 1, 2, 3, and then exhaling. So that's all good, not necessary. And then the third point is that explaining the effect that will reduce his arousal level. And so therefore it'll help him become more relaxed, and therefore his fear response won't escalate when he sees a cockroach. Now, when you're talking about CBT, let's go back a bit. This relates to the cognitive model of psychology that argues that a phobia is a result of a cognitive bias. So just be mindful about that, particularly if you get a beefy scenario with a few marks allocated. So what you need to emphasize here with CBT for a phobia is you need to explain each component and then how they're linked. So the cognitive component is basically an evaluation of the thoughts, feelings about the phobic stimulus. And then the behavioural component is identifying the maladaptive behaviour, which might be avoidance or some type of dysfunction, or our social and emotional well-being might be compromised, etc. And then we need to link the two, link the cognitive and the behavioural components, because what we've done in the cognitive component is we've evaluated the thoughts, and then we've learned to make a cognitive reappraisal or cognitive restructure. And as a result of that, once we've done that, then we're able to address the maladaptive behaviour and move from dysfunctional behaviour to functional behaviour and demonstrate more social and emotional well-being. Okay, so just to illustrate this question here doesn't relate to a phobia, but I just wanted to basically reinforce the 3-pronged approach to explaining CBT. So we've got some rellos here, and they're feeling some self-blame and guilt about caring for their loved ones. And this one's asking about CBT, how it can improve their MH, mental health. So again, the first mark is for explaining the cognitive component, that we help them identify the link between the thoughts and feelings and their behaviour, relating it to the scenario. The behavioural aspect, we look at basically how those thoughts and feelings identified in the cognitive are influencing their maladaptive behaviour, e.g. they might be showing a level of dysfunction, there might be impairment in their social well-being, they're kind of becoming disconnected with people. And then we link the two. And this is where students fail to score that 3rd mark, the link between cognitive and behavioural. Because during the cognitive, we learn about those triggers, we learn to cognitively restructure. The behavioural part, we learn about the maladaptive behaviour. So because we've learned to cognitively restructure our thoughts about how we look after our rellos with Alzheimer's, then we're able to address that maladaptive behaviour and now implement more adaptive behaviour. Sounds pretty simple. It's not, obviously, but that's how the model works. Now, most students are pretty good at explaining how systematic desensitization works generically, but that'll only get you half marks at best. You need to be able to apply this to a scenario you're given. So check out this question from 6 years ago. Serena was stung by a bee. And now she's got a phobia of bees and other bugs. Explain how systematic desensitization would help her. So the first mark is for explaining well, it doesn't have to be the first mark, but one mark for relaxation strategies. So she could use breathing retraining, etc. Then the second point we need to emphasize the fact that she needs to create a hierarchy. Now, this can't be generic. You need to relate this to bees. And ideally, your fear hierarchy gives an example of something low, like looking at a photo or a picture of a bee. And then something high would be being in a room full of bees buzzing around or having some physically on her. That might trigger 100 out of 100 in terms of her fear intensity. Step 3, put them together and make sure you mention that we start at the bottom of the hierarchy. So she looks at the picture of the bee, and that triggers a level of fear, and then she implements her relaxation strategy, which might be breathing retraining, and then she calms down. And then when she's got that calm to an adaptive level, she moves up the next rung of the hierarchy, and she keeps working her way up systematically, desensitizing herself to her fear. And then we need to finish by emphasizing that once she gets all the way to the top of the hierarchy, she can have a bee land on her, and she will no longer have a panic attack because she's had LTD in terms of her brain. She's basically rewired those fear pathways in her brain by repeatedly exposing herself to the levels of the hierarchy and desensitizing herself thanks to her relaxation strategy. Now, when you're explaining psychoeducation, emphasis on the fact that this is a social treatment, that is critical. And so therefore the intent of this is we're pitching this to the relatives and the supporters of the person who's suffering from the phobia, because again, we're taking a BPS approach. So we're not using this in isolation. We're combining this with the CBT, with the benzos, it's with the breathing retraining, etc. And the 2 points mentioned in the study design are we're going to call out any unrealistic thoughts that the patient might identify. And we're also going to call out avoidant behaviour. So back to Dave here and his cockroach issue. This one's asking for an evidence-based social intervention that we can use. So because it's an intervention, social support is not going to cut it. That's a strategy that we use to enhance well-being, but it's not an intervention strategy. So therefore, we've got to use psychoeducation. So there's the first mark. Second mark for emphasising that we target his supporters, family and friends, to help him deal with his issues in terms of cockroaches. And then we need to get specific and say that we challenge his unrealistic thoughts. We call it out when he kind of says, I'm not going to so-and-so's house because there might be a cockroach. And also we're going to discourage that avoidance and going, come on, mate, get back on the horse. Even if there is a cockroach, we can catch it. It won't harm you, etc. Let's get back out there, buddy. So then we get on to the protective factors, which I talked about before. So these are not intervention strategies. These are just protective factors that we can all employ in order to keep us at that mental health end of the continuum or move us there if we're going through a rough patch or there's a level of mental illness. And again, we encourage the interaction between biological, psychological, and social, which is the whole essence of the BPS model. So how much do we need to know about nutritional intake? Look, we don't need to go health and HD on this. We just need to emphasize that we need a balanced diet and we need to have a degree of abstinence from drugs, alcohol, etc. In order to maximize our mental health. Sleep. We should all be gurus on this, given we've kind of dedicated about 20% of our entire time this year working on AOS 1 Unit 4, but emphasis on the fact that good sleep hygiene will enhance our resilience and our mental functioning, particularly our REM sleep. And CBT strategies. So again, this is not an intervention. This is just a strategy to maintain our well-being. So again, same approach as before. The cognitive component is we teach people how to, first of all, call themselves out in terms of the triggers of any rumination or any negative thoughts, etc. And then we teach them strategies to cognitively restructure and basically give them strategies to have more positive thinking. The behavioural component is teaching the person how to identify any maladaptive behaviour, which could be a level of dysfunction, so therefore they're not turning up to school, work. It could be impaired social and emotional well-being, so they're withdrawing from people. So we're actually educating the people that the thoughts is having a negative influence on their behaviour, and identifying what that maladaptive behaviour looks like, and then put the two together. So once the person's learned the link between the thoughts and the behaviour, and they're in a position to restructure their thoughts, then they're also in a position to demonstrate that more adaptive behaviour. And so improving their level of function, getting back to work, improving their social and emotional well-being, starting to mix with their mates, etc. Mindfulness meditation is actually two different things here. So the mindfulness is being mentally present, aware of the sights and sounds in your environment, and therefore clearing your mind of the rumination about past issues, not being anxious about all the stuff we've got to manage in the future. The meditation is helping reduce our physiological arousal by being still and focusing on some internal mechanism like our breathing. This is not an intervention strategy. Again, it's a protective factor to enhance our well-being. Now, even though social support there's a degree of common sense here, in the study design, it actually references it's got to be authentic and energizing. So just be mindful of that when we do seek out social support from our mates, family, partner, authentic is it's genuine in terms of, I guess, the empathy from that person and its energy, because we come out of that interaction with a degree of vitality and enthusiasm. So there are points of emphasis there. So when you're talking about cultural continuity, be mindful of both words. So we're looking at the historical traditions of First Nations people, and their continuity is basically ensuring that we can carry them forward across multiple generations. And again, be mindful that First Nations people have a holistic approach to social and emotional well-being, and therefore we can incorporate this through self-determination, which is the ongoing process of choice, so that we ensure that First Nations people have a voice in addressing intergenerational trauma, land rights, dealing with racism, etc.